So, all right, well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. As they said, my name is Andrew Rubin. My co-presenter is Nicholas Anderson. We're both attorneys here in Denver, and we're both Syracuse Law alumni, which was our connection for initially meeting each other. But anyways, I am an associate attorney here at Greenberg, Traurig in Denver. I focus my practice on community development and infrastructure finance, plus tax. So I work on a lot of municipal bond, tax credit finance, and tribal finance matters, as well as doing a lot of work with nonprofits, and as well as some SALT work throughout the Rocky Mountains and desert Southwest. I've been with GT for about 4 years, but have been practicing law for 12, and just really enjoy the positive impact that we can have on the community through a number of tax incentivized programs that we'll talk to you about today. And I'll turn it over to Nicholas to introduce himself.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I'm Nicholas Anderson. I'm with Lathrop GPM Counsel here in our Denver office. I also do a lot of tax credit incentive work, most significantly in the new markets tax credit space, and then low-income housing tax credit space. Those are kind of my bread and butter, and the things that I enjoy the most. Seeing the impacts of those projects, knowing that you're providing housing for people, knowing that you're helping businesses grow in what can be challenging communities, creating jobs. There is a lot of satisfaction there. So it's a great place to be doing this career. I also do a lot of corporate tax work as one of the firm's sort of national resources for corporate tax matters. And then I also kind of dabble in nonprofits and business organizations, so a lot of LLCs and partnerships, in addition to all of the other things that I've already mentioned. So I think we're ready to get going, and I'll let Andrew lead it off here.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, so as he mentioned, we've both described we both are in some ways jack of all trades, but with this strong focus on projects that really boost communities and help improve quality of life and opportunity to resources for people. So the first topic we're going to cover today is municipal bonds, and in particular tax-exempt municipal bonds. So, as you've probably gathered in the news or in an investment portfolio, state and local governments issue quite a bit of debt. It is a multi-billion, if not multi-trillion-dollar market of state and local governments across the country issuing debt to pay for a whole variety of programs. Primarily, the debt takes the form of bonds or promissory notes or certificates of participation as sort of the primary investment structure. I'll go over each of those real quickly. Bonds are issued by the governmental entity, and they'll put that into the market or have it privately placed. Notes resemble your typical, in many ways, your typical promissory note that you might have with a car loan or a mortgage. And those would be, instead of issued, they're described more as incurred by the borrower, by that governmental entity. And then certificates of participation is a creature unto itself, in that essentially what will happen is in the vast majority of cases is the borrower will essentially sell a property and lease it back to itself, the counterparty being a corporate trustee essentially. And then the debt instrument going into the markets is a certificate of participation, essentially to have proceeds from those lease payments that are paid by the borrower in that scenario. A reason, as we'll touch on later, as to why someone might do that is because because they need an underlying collateral source to make the financing work, or because in some states that is not considered debt for state law purposes, and it may help get you around certain voter approvals that are required. And we'll cover that a little bit more later on. And then the next area, or the next topic on that, is the different security and repayment sources. Oh, and we have our first pop-up here. For those following along, have you or your company participated in a tax credit transaction or benefited from a public tax incentive? Yes or no? So there are different types of repayment sources that are generally used, and I'll just highlight sort of these two primary sources on it. One is general obligation bonds, which is essentially the government saying it's pledging its full faith and credit to the repayment of those bonds. Oh, and we have our results there, as you saw. But so they're pledging their full faith and credit to the repayment of the bonds, and that essentially means that they'll take from any of the available revenue sources that governmental entity has, whether it's property taxes or sales tax or various fee revenue that the government may have. That although they may include a particular revenue stream as sort of the target resource, technically they're obligating themselves to pay it from any available resource that they have. And then the other primary type of repayment source is, and security is a revenue bond, where you're saying, rather than give my full faith and credit, I'm obligated to pay from any source. It's saying, I will repay these bonds, this debt, specifically from X revenue stream. And that could be the highway tolls from a particular toll system. It could be certain revenues coming out of, say, a municipally owned stadium. It could be revenues from a public power company or from a municipal water company, as specifically that revenue stream, as opposed to the general world of revenues that the borrower has access to. And then the primary parties, to give context to, as we talk about the different components that go in, as to who the different parties are that might be in a financing. So typically we refer to the borrower as an issuer, because they are issuing bonds as debt, they are issuing the debt. But you can think of them as the borrower. Occasionally, and actually quite frequently, to be honest, you might have something called a conduit borrower, where a governmental entity is the issuer of the debt, but they're going to use the money to lend it to the underlying borrower, say a 501c3 nonprofit. And so that is called a conduit borrower. It's really, in the end, it's a debt obligation of that borrower, but you need a governmental issuer for it to be a municipal bond and to satisfy the tax exemption requirements. And then, so that's sort of your borrower side of it. The next step is your lender side, and lender may be too broad of a term to conflate all of these into, or too precise of a term. You have, if the debt is going directly to a bank, that would be a lender, as you traditionally think of. But oftentimes municipal bonds are sold into the market, and so you'll have an underwriter who helps the issuer put together the transaction, figure out the proper sources of security, the proper terms, and then they will be the initial purchaser of the debt, with the purpose that they will sell it into the broader market, whether that market is financial institutions, primarily municipal bond funds, mutual funds, or if that is retail customers, oftentimes you and I can go buy the debt of a municipality, whether it's at $1,000 or $5,000 a piece. And so the underwriter is that sort of market maker of buying that initial debt and selling it into the market. There also at times is another party that sort of ties in here called a placement agent. And there's someone who might in other cases be an underwriter. It may, same entities that serve as underwriters often serve as placement agents, but they're helping you identify that private party who's going to buy the debt as opposed to selling it to a public market. And so it may be that they place the debt with a lender, or they place it with a particular fund that's looking for this type of debt to finance. The primary difference between the underwriter and the placement agent is the placement agent at no point is actually owning the bonds, owning the debt. They're merely just connecting the dots, whereas the underwriter is connecting those dots by temporarily buying the bonds before reselling it into the markets. And then oftentimes, moving on to the next participant in these transactions, you frequently will have either a municipal advisor or financial advisor who serves as a fiduciary to the borrower, to the issuer, helping them figure out whether they're getting a good deal, helping them identify the best financing opportunity out there, whereas the underwriter or a placement agent do not have a fiduciary responsibility to the borrower. That municipal advisor, financial advisor does have a fiduciary duty to the borrower in helping identify that they're getting the best opportunity. And oftentimes it's, they may have to provide an opinion that says, this is a reasonable interest rate based on other similar borrowers and similar financing structures in the market at the time. Oftentimes that's really focused on, is it a reasonable interest rate? And particularly in scenarios where the debt is being privately placed, to make sure that there's not some shenanigans of insiders buying the debt and doing it at an inflated interest rate. The next participant in these transactions, and perhaps one of the most important ones, is frequently a trustee. And this is officially the counterparty in the financing documents to the issuer when there's not a direct lender. So you'll have where the trustee executes the indenture with the issuer, the indenture being sort of the bond equivalent of a loan agreement or a security agreement. It'll have very similar terms, but it just is structured a little bit differently. So the trustee will be the counterparty, and then the trustee will maintain various funds of money in connection with the bonds. So you may have, you'll certainly have a revenue fund, where as the issuer receives tax revenue or other revenues that are dedicated to pay back the bonds, that will be deposited in a revenue fund at the trustee, and is only accessible to be used to repay the bonds. There may also be a reserve fund, adding as additional security in case the issuer does not have sufficient revenues to repay to make a particular bond payment. There can also be a surplus fund, which is like an added reserve fund that gets filled up over time rather than being funded out of bond proceeds. And then there may also be a project fund, which is monies come in when you sell the bonds. You get your deposit of your loan proceeds, you put it in the bank, and there may be restrictions on your ability to spend it right away. And so it will sit in an account at the trustee, and that may provide additional security for the bondholders, whether it's because there are certain restrictions before you can withdraw it, or just because it's held there so it's accessible should there be a default under the indenture and on the bonds. And then the last, I guess these questions are a little early, but well, topically, but the trustee often will also serve as a bond registrar, tracking who are the holders of the debt, as well as a paying agent actually handling the processing of the payment to the bondholders when that happens, whether on a monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, or annual basis. And then the last party here is the bond insurer. And in some cases, the issuer will go out and seek bond insurance, and essentially the bond insurer will make a promise to make any debt payments of principal and interest that the issuer misses for whatever reason. You don't, to get bond insurance, 99% of the time you have to have an investment grade credit rating from one of the three main rating agencies, S&P, Fitch, or Moody's, and then you will go and pay a premium to the insurer for them to insure the bonds. They may also provide a surety bond to cover the reserve fund so that you don't have to fund a reserve fund at closing. And so those are the primary market participants for municipal bonds. So moving on to the next slide. I shouldn't click extra. The highlight here, of course, because we're here to talk about tax, and certainly there can be bonds that don't qualify for the tax exemption. But what we want to talk about is this tax exemption. And so under Section 103 of the Internal Revenue Code, gross income does not include interest on any state or local bond, and a bond being an obligation of a state or political subdivision thereof. That is the quote unquote definition of a state or local bond. Now, there are certainly some exceptions here, as we see that any private activity bond, which is not a qualified bond within the meaning of Section 148, that does not qualify. Any arbitrage bond also does not qualify. And any bond, unless such bond meets the applicable requirements of Section 149, is not eligible for the tax exemption. Now, what does this mean? Because obviously, the issuer, as a governmental entity, they don't pay taxes. They collect a lot of taxes. So what does it mean for there to be tax exempt bonds? And it's that to the bondholder, to the person who's effectively a lender, they would not have to pay income taxes on the interest income that they receive from being a holder of that bond or that note. And obviously, and we'll talk in the next few slides about a whole variety of ways in which the borrower, the issuer, has to comply with provisions to help maintain that status. And what the issuer will do as part of the transaction is they'll execute what we call a tax certificate, sometimes called an arbitrage and rebate certificate, or arbitrage and tax certificate, sometimes called a tax compliance certificate. There are a variety of different names depending upon the firm serving as bond counsel. But essentially, they will execute a certificate promising to comply with the various rules of the Internal Revenue Code under Section 103 and under Sections 141 through 149, as well as the regulations thereunder, in order to make sure that the interest on those bonds stays tax exempt to the lender, to the bondholder. And the primary benefit there is you'll see a reduction in the interest rate that the borrower would otherwise have to pay. In many respects, we describe it as essentially correlated to the corporate tax rate, or the top tax rate available to individuals. Is sort of what the expected differential between taxable and tax-exempt bonds might be for the interest rate. So potentially a 20 to 30% savings in interest costs to the borrower as a result of that, which is very useful when, as an example, when you're the state of Colorado and you're issuing $500 million in bonds to pay for road projects, saving 30% off the interest rate, say cutting off 1 or 2 percentage points, that is a big cost savings when you're talking about such large dollars and repayment over a 20 or 30 year horizon. So it can really help. And then one of the primary requirements in order to qualify as a bond for tax exemption purposes is it has to actually be debt for federal tax purposes. But that's not to say that it has to be debt for state law purposes. So the example I gave earlier with the certificates of participation, here in Colorado, you have to have voter approval, a vote of the people, before you can issue debt or increase taxes. And so this sale and leaseback structure going into the certificates of participation is not considered debt for state law purposes, because the debt is actually issued by the trustee, not by the state, who is merely just selling and leasing back the property. The caveat, though, there is debt for state law purposes in Colorado is a multi-fiscal year obligation, and so it actually has to be, that leaseback has to be subject to annual appropriation. So this, for federal tax purposes, this financing structure with the sale leaseback for purposes of Section 103 is considered a debt instrument. And one of the key components there is that you have to show separately stated interest component. You can't just say, here's the rental payment under the lease. It's, here's the portion of the rent that is principal, and here's the portion of the rent that is interest. So we talked at the top about the aspect of avoiding that only private activity bonds that are qualified can qualify for the tax, for the exemption on interest. So what is the concern there? It's that you can't have 10% of the business use of the 10% of the usage of your underlying asset that's being financed be used by private parties, and you can't have 10% of your payments or your security come from private payments. And alternatively, you can't, you have to satisfy what we call the private loan test. Private business use, and this will get to a component we'll talk about later on, is any use except for use by a state or local government or sort of the general public is considered private use. So use by a 501c3 is private use. Use by or payments from the federal government is considered private use. So an example transaction that I saw attempted at one point was to finance a municipal power authority, but they wanted to sell, because of where they were geographically, sell the bulk of the power to an local army base. That transaction would not qualify for the tax exemption because the federal government, as the army, their payments would be considered private because it would be like a dedicated stream there, and their usage of using the bulk of the power would also break the test there as well. That's not to say that there can't be any private usage. If you've got say a municipal office building, you could provide for private parties to use a portion of it at times, and we measure it by a space-time analysis. So you could have someone using, say, 9% of the office space 12 months out of the year. That would be okay. If they used 11% of the office space for 12 months a year, that would not be okay. But you could also have a scenario where they use 11% of the office space, but only for 6 months of the year. And so that only equates to like 5.5% private usage. There are certain scenarios, of course, where the 10% drops to 5%, but those are beyond the scope of what we're covering today. And the private payment component is really focusing on not having it guaranteed by private parties, other than the bond insurer. It's not a developer promising to pay the debt if for some reason it's not paid. And then the private loan component, just really quickly, is making sure that the government is not borrowing for the primary purpose of then relending the money to another party. There are some scenarios where private activity is okay, and in particular, it's for some industrial projects we think of: airports, docks, wharves, mass commuting facilities, high-speed intercity rail facilities, certain utility scenarios. Those are okay so long as 95% of bond proceeds, net of a reasonably required reserve fund, are dedicated to those uses. And then there's also exemptions for qualified mortgage bonds, and qualified 501c3 bonds. The primary concern in private activity bonds is also that there is a dollar limit to how much can be issued in a given year, and so you will need to beware of those limitations, that there's only so much that can be put into the market at a time. And then the last topic we're going to cover on municipal bonds before jumping into the tax credits, which are also very exciting, is infrastructure through special taxing districts, whether they are metropolitan districts, business improvement districts, as to what we typically call them in Colorado, or in Florida they say community development districts, and they can have a variety of names depending upon where you are. Essentially, these exist because in the 70s and 80s, local government embraced a new model that said, let developmental growth pay its own way. So rather than the city paying for the roads for that new development at the edge of town, let the developer or the residents or business owners in that neighborhood pay for it themselves. And so these entities are organized by a vote of the property owners within the proposed boundaries. Depending upon what state they're in, they may have the ability to impose property taxes, sales taxes, special assessments, or certain capital fees. It could be a $10,000 fee per new home built, or it could just be a 20 or 50 mil increase in property taxes, that those developments might pay. And in some ways, these this local government will, or this district will, issue debt to pay for the infrastructure that will then be financed by the property taxes primarily, of the homes or businesses, for the next 30 years. The burden of that infrastructure cost is located on those particular homes, which the developer, if they were paying for it themselves, would pass that through in the home cost. But oftentimes what happens in terms of, since you need local government approval from the city or the county or the town, whatever it may be, based on where you are, they'll impose certain requirements also. It could be expanded parks in that community, or certain other amenities that go with it. What you will not find in those communities are gates. And that's because, looking back at that private use test, it has to be open to the general public. And so if you have a gated community, Nicholas and I can't go walk around your community and use that road. And that's sort of the easiest way to view that. In theory, he and I can't go use your sewer either, but the sewer is for all the residents generally. What it can't pay for, though, is private improvements, cable, phone, the lateral off of the main water pipe to the house, or from the sewer from the street to your house. But it'll cover those things through that primary roadway area, and fund parks and stuff. Good examples in Colorado: the Anthem neighborhood up in Broomfield, that is metropolitan district. That's why you have those extended roadway, those beautiful roads, those great parks and amenities. Excuse me. The same goes for the Sterling Ranch development on the south side of Denver, south of Chatfield. You get those big master plan communities in Colorado because they can fund that infrastructure through the property taxes going forward. And the last component I want to touch here is all of that infrastructure will either needs to be owned by a governmental entity, whether that's the district or it's dedicated to the local Parks and Rec district, or to the city or county, depending upon the particular scenario. And you could also, if you're doing a redevelopment project, there could be tax increment financing that helps support it, where you get additional tax revenue that would have gone to other governmental entities from these properties. That'll help fund those parts of the project as well. And that wraps up municipal bonds. I don't see any questions in the chat about them. So with that said, we will move on to new markets tax credits, which is a wonderful area that both Nick and I have a lot of experience with.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll kind of lead the discussion on new markets, but invite Andrew to jump in whenever he wants to round out any ideas. As you noted, we both have a lot of experience in this area, so it's probably the personal passion that we share here on tax credits and incentives. The new markets tax credit is, as noted, provided by Section 45D of the code. It is a credit that is constantly subject to additional renewals and expirations. This actually next round of credits is actually the last authorization under the current tax law. So new markets could potentially expire, though. Everybody, I think, in our community certainly hopes that it'll get renewed, and there's some optimism.
And it certainly has bipartisan support in Congress, and may just be a question of getting it tacked onto the right bill for other infrastructure as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the current challenge in Washington is getting anything done, but hopefully after the events of the last couple of days, we'll start seeing some movement as things start getting moving. The new markets tax credit is designed to incentivize investment in businesses rather than building housing or things like that. It's really to help develop businesses. It's why it can be such a useful tool, and can really, go a long way in having impacts on the community beyond just sort of an individual or a family. It can really, revitalize communities in many respects. And these, the communities hit are what's known as low-income communities, as designated by qualified census tracts. So we'll be getting a new set here come up in a couple of years after the most recent census that just wrapped up. And they typically, the investments, rather than being, true equity investments within, business or developer, typically take the form of low interest loans. Andrew, do you mind going to the next slide? So the basics. The new markets tax credit, the investor generally receives a 39% federal tax credit on its qualified equity investment into a qualified community development entity. That's a QEI into a QCDE or CDE. We love our acronyms in the new market tax credit space. So there will be lots of them. And so the CDEs have to have received an allocation of new markets from the CDFI fund. New markets is an allocated credit, which means there's a limited pool. Most rounds have been approximately 3.5 billion. The upcoming round that all of our CDEs are getting ready to apply for are, I think their applications due next week. So they really are right down at the wire. That round is going to be a $5 billion round. So hopefully there will be a lot of impact, and we'll see some good movement in the markets, and hopefully maybe even some changes in the tax law upcoming that will make tax credits a little more beneficial investment for corporations. So there's a little heavier market interest. So the CDs have to put substantially all of their equity investment into the loan or equity investment into what's known as a qualified active low income community business, otherwise known as the QUALIC-B. Our qualifies are really the businesses on the ground operating within the low-income communities. So they're the ones that are receiving the benefits. So in general, that means that over a 7-year compliance period, new market tax credit will generate on a $10 million equity investment, $3.9 million in tax credits there. Sorry. So that 3.9 million is, it does not mean that the investor is putting in a full $10 million of their own cash. Generally, there's a leverage process. These are leveraged financing, so the investor will put in roughly, well, given current market rates, 70-ish cents on the dollar for the tax credits that they're getting. I've seen as high as 92, 93 cents when tax credits were really in vogue just before the Tax Credits and Jobs Act was enacted. But you know, hopefully we'll get closer to that sooner rather than later. I did see a. Oh.
And what Nicholas is alluding to there is similar to the municipal bonds. The value of the tax credits or the value of that interest savings is driven in large part by the corporate tax rate. So there's a greater market when you have a higher corporate tax rate than when you have a lower corporate tax rate in terms of the value to both programs from an investor standpoint.
Exactly. And so then I think we can go on to the next slide. Just kind of noting as we go that the investors basically set up investment funds. Most of the investors are the large banks that everyone has heard of, US Bank, Wells Fargo, Chase. There are some private funds that are, you know, becoming participants in the field, especially when tax credit or the payments for tax credits are lower. You know, when you're in the 70s, it's a little more palatable for the private funds to make the new market tax credit investments, and they can be a lot more competitive as compared to, you know, your US Bank. But talking about our quality requirements, so again, these are the qualities are the businesses that are operating in the communities. They can be any corporation, including a nonprofit corporation, and that part is key. I've done a lot of nonprofit deals. They can have a lot of community impact, and there are ways to make the deals work that work both from, you know, an investment standpoint for our tax credit investors, but also work for our nonprofits such that they're really receiving benefits. And they can also be structured, the qualities can also be structured as a partnership, but they do have to be, you know, sort of recognized businesses. There is a concept of, you know, where you can have sort of a portion of the business. Those deals are a little bit more complicated. They're very common, so certainly any experienced new market tax credit attorney is going to know how to structure with a portion of the business. But generally that can be sort of a division or single member LLC that's disregarded for federal income tax purposes of, you know, an operating corporation or partnership. So you're really still talking about, you know, your borrower being a corporation or partnership. And so kind of, you know, there's a lot of tests that the qualifier has to meet. In every deal, there's a significant tax opinion from both qualifier and the CDE, and then of course as investor counsel, we also give an overall tax opinion to our investor clients. So these transactions do a lot of brain damage to the tax attorneys that are on them. You know, we're going through 100-page projections and, you know, drafting 60-page opinions on a regular basis. But, you know, it's quality work because you learn about a lot of different tax rules. And so, you know, 50% of the income has to be derived within the low-income community. So if you have a business that has, think McDonald's, where there's locations all over the place, even most franchisees own multiple locations. You'd really probably want to focus solely on the location within your low-income community and make that a portion of the business rather than doing, every franchise location. The tangible property needs to be within the low-income community. It's really to make sure all of these rules are designed to ensure that the incentive dollars, the benefit of the new market tax credit transactions, are really hitting these low-income communities, not someone put a PO box in the right place, or opened up a branch office, but really all the good jobs are over here in the high income community. It's really trying to drive investment and activity into our low income communities. There's a couple of sort of restrictive tests, not having non-qualified financial property, basically meaning that a bank could not be a quality, and then restricting collectibles. We don't want new market tax credit dollars going to someone purchasing art or other things like that. There is also a sort of sin business component to new markets restrictions on qualities. The sin businesses can be kind of amusing. Liquor stores, golf courses, tanning salons, massage parlors. Although interestingly, I have worked on deals where we were benefiting a casino in some respects, sort of doing the more resort portion of the casino land. And again, that was a portion of the business, but they had a day spa. And so we had to make sure that, that day spa didn't cross over into a massage parlor, and kind of, you really have to think about the operations of your business. So it can be pretty fascinating in those respects.
And one of the surprising components that's not per se a sin business as anybody would think, but there are limitations on including agricultural operations.
Yes.
So if you're doing an indoor grow house of a federally legal product like salad, like lettuce, even that may not be an eligible business to be in the Qualic B or a tenant of the Qualic B.
Correct, and always a topic of interest in Colorado is generally nobody is going to allow you to operate a marijuana related business using new market tax credit dollars. There's some argument that you could thread that needle, but I don't think anybody's going to take the opinion standpoint. I've also seen that conversation in opportunity zones as well, where you could do it, but we would recommend that you don't. Why don't we head to the next slide then? So the next slide kind of gives a typical new market tax credit structure chart. As everyone can see, this one's actually one of the more basic structure charts and very common that we'll see in our projections. You have your new market tax credit investor. They are, that's your big bank. They set up a investment fund that they're the sole member of, making sure that the tax credits flow through to the investor. Frequently, the funds get the interest in the funds get syndicated to other corporations that have significant tax burdens that they would like to offset with tax credits. And I think we have a slide that goes into some syndication later on in the presentation. You have your leverage lender. The leverage lenders frequently are, a single purpose entity that's going to make a loan into our investment fund and have some relationship to our Qualic B borrower. We like to keep some differentiation, generally minimum 5%. But the leverage lender could even be, a typical bank, a community bank that might be interested in supporting a project, but doesn't have an interest in tax credits. It can be the funds that go into the leverage lender can come from a number of different sources. It can be from cash on hand that the borrowers, the sponsor might have. Say Habitat for Humanity. If they were doing a new markets investment, or excuse me, a new markets project in one of their communities, they might have a special purpose entity as their qualified borrower, and make sort of a cash contribution into the leverage lender that allows this structure to work. And so the leverage really sort of closes that gap between what the new market tax credit investor is willing to pay for the tax credits received. So in our example, they're putting in $3 million and receiving $3.9 million of new market tax credits. So they're paying, what's that, roughly 80 cents on the dollar for the tax credit, which would actually be fantastic pricing today. Then we have our sub-CDE. That's a subsidiary that our community development entity will have set up. They're the ones who receive the allocation of tax credits. They generally put in they have a 0.01% interest in the subsidy that they maintain, and the investment fund takes the other portion. And then there's a loan. The loan will be interest only for 7 years, sometimes slightly beyond that to allow for smooth exits. And then after 7 years, then there's principal and interest that gets repaid over, whatever, frankly, whatever period the projections can financially support. But that's sort of the general overview of how a new market tax credit transaction would work. The types of projects that the tax credit can be used for can range from community health centers, YMCAs, but I've also seen significant private businesses that rail car renovation facilities, steel mills. It can really range the gamut. The qualic Bs can range from subsidiaries of stock exchange listed companies to very small nonprofits to community health clinics. And the structures of the deals can really range from sort of a real estate only portion where our borrower is will own the land and building and then lease it back to the sponsor, or it can be an operating business and really provide cash flow to that operating business. It's a very versatile tax credit. It's one that can support a lot of different things and does a lot of good.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think that's really a point of emphasis to everyone, and responds to a question we got earlier of to what extent does the new markets program actually improve life in these low income census tracts? Is there reportable data on it? I certainly know that oftentimes these are projects where both the CDE as well as the tax credit investor look at it and say, these are projects that not only make economic sense for us, but we want to brag about them and show our impact in the community, whether it's through job creation or providing community services. And so there will actually be a community impact agreement where they have to report back the sponsor of the qualified as to what impact they're actually having in those communities. Nick, are you aware of specific statistics overall reporting on it?
CDFI the CDFI fund might have sort of overall reporting statistics. Every CDE has to do annual reporting, or actually I think semi-annual reporting if memory serves, to the CDFI fund on sort of the status of their projects, the status of the loans that they've made, and are their borrowers sort of achieving the metrics that they really set forward? And again, these are competitive credits. So when you're applying for allocation, you're listing, okay, these are our goals of what we want to accomplish with these dollars. And then in the next round of applications, you're going to say, we hit these goals that we told you we wanted to hit, or we exceeded these goals. And so that's really, I think, that's really where most of our CDEs are accountable, to the program. I think every CD that I've worked with, and I've worked with a lot of them, really takes that part of their duty seriously. They want to make sure that, if they're going to tell the CDFI fund that they're going to, make loans to projects to help create 200 jobs, well, darn it, that project better hit the job number, because it's really important. And if it's not, then there has to be a good reason why it didn't. I mean, certainly, in the COVID related times, where, okay, well, the project stalled, so we've had, some extension of deadlines, things like that. Those are key, but every CD is looking to have the biggest impact. And frankly, the investors are too. The investors know that for this program to continue, to get the allocations, get additional, extensions, they have to hit the metrics that they really are seeking out. I know, frankly, a lot of them also use this for CRA compliance. So, if they're not going to hit the metrics, they're probably going to fall out of compliance for CRA. So it's important for their business as well.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue into this question we've received, which is from William Martin, is there risk of losing projected credits due to defaults and failures of businesses borrowing from CDEs? So I guess to rephrase the question, what happens if the Qualic B fails, or the related the leverage lender as the sponsor, related to them? What happens if the underlying project is a bust?
Yeah, so it really depends on the amount of recapture, right? So if the Qualic B borrower goes bust and the CDE can't reclaim, get back any of the money, they don't really consider that a need to reinvest, because there's all the dollars are gone. As long as you had sort of a good faith understanding, which is why we give all of our opinions at the beginning of the transaction, that it was reasonable to have made this loan into this borrower, and that they were going to accomplish this, then there's no recapture of the tax credits in that situation. Now, if there is a repayment of principal, then to the extent of that repayment of principal, the subsidies would need to find a new borrower, loan the money to them, and within a certain defined period of time, and then that new loan would basically just tack on. So if that happened in year 2, you'd have to have a compliant loan for 5 more years in order to not have tax credit recapture. But that is a great question.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer on it. Before we jump on to the next topic, which we'll do pretty quickly, just wanted to throw out so people could sort of conceptualize this a little bit more, an example of how the structure might work. I recently did a transaction for one of the branches of Goodwill Industries. As you know, they do thrift stores, as well as career services training, which is really their exempt purposes, is that job training. And so what happened was the local Goodwill branch served as the leveraged lender. They were the primary source of funding into the deal. They had already acquired the land on which the new store and career services center would be built. If they didn't have the need in this particular, actually they did. They did have a source lender, so it would be a component that sits just one level above the leverage lender, essentially. In many cases, a traditional loan coming in, which could be from the a party related to the tax credit equity investor or just another bank, but essentially traditional loan there to help them have that seed funding into the deal. The qualic at the bottom was a special purpose entity whose purpose was to own and build the project, build the new store and career services center, and then leasing it back to the local branch that the leverage lender is the sponsor, just sort of connecting that dot. The qualic has no employees because it's really there just as solely as the real estate owner, but just wanted to give people a more direct example of how that might work, as well as some of the other components, taking this slide to a next level in complexity there. So that
that kind of wraps up new markets. This is just sort of, if anybody wants the slides, a translation of the alphabet soup that you might see in a new markets transaction.
Great.
So the low-income housing tax credit, pretty quickly. Obviously, this is a credit designed to create affordable housing for low-income individuals. It's a 10-year credit period, but 15-year compliance period, and there's often an extended use period that will go for an additional 15 years, basically restricting the rents on that property for upwards of 30 years. But the credit period is really for 10 years, and after that period, then the tax credit investor will generally make a exit, and the developer will own the property outright, at least as far as the tax credit structure goes, and we'll continue running it. Sometimes there's rehabilitation so that you can start your tax credit period again. Depending on the finances of it. Rehab, there is a component there's your acquisition credits and your rehab credits. Generally, there's two types of credits. Your 9% credit is done through a competitive allocation process through the states. Every state gets a certain number of credits allocated to them, and then they apportion it as sort of their own priorities dictate. Here in Colorado, the Colorado Housing Finance Authority handles that allocation process. And then there's a 4% credit that is done through tax-exempt bonds, generally through a conduit financing structure. It is limited by the volume cap each state has available that's listed to affordable housing, but every state that I'm aware of will take their unused volume cap at the end of every year for other projects, and will put it to the volume cap for affordable housing. So most states never run out of volume cap for housing. And I apologize, but it looks like we are out of time. But there is some nice basic information on LIHTC here. Syndication, certainly for anyone that, any companies that are looking to offset their tax liabilities. There are a lot of people that want to make investments into tax credits. They can do that through a syndication process, and that's kind of that. Yeah. And then there's a brief information on the historics as well.
Yeah, and with the LIHTC and the new markets, I would describe to a lot of people, they're meant for the same communities. LIHTC for housing, new markets for jobs and community services. Yeah. And then the last topic we've got, which we've run out of time for, but will be in the slides, and that'll be distributed, is the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit. And that's a credit of 20% that's spread out over 5 years. And the most complicated part there is that you have to get historic designation from the National Park Service. So it's very limited in terms of the types of properties it can actually be used on. a quick response to the admins. The question that was still sitting in the Q&A was one that we covered earlier. But this is our contact information if you have any questions or would like to speak to us further about any of these programs. Both Nick and I are happy to discuss with anyone, and we can stick around if there's any additional questions.